Gabe Nadales. So let's start from the beginning.
Sure.
What is Antifa?
So Antifa is a movement, and it encompasses several different left-wing radical organizations, and they have a very simple goal, and it is to fight fascism, which sounds like a great thing, but once you actually analyze it and look at who their actual target is, you realize that they're out there to destroy capitalism and American society in general.
So Antifa Capitalism, this sounds like a melding of just typical left-wing talking points. Are you seeing that as far as the ideology?
Yeah, so Antifa, you have to really look at the ideology of Antifa. You have to go into all of the different left-wing groups that make up the movement. One of the most prominent ones in America today is the Young Democratic Socialists of America. And I mean, this is an actual pro-socialist group. They've endorsed Bernie Sanders, and they've endorsed several different candidates all throughout the country at either state level or even lower than that. And they're very much open about supporting socialism. And if you look at the riots in Minnesota, groups like the Young Democratic Socialists for America, specifically in the cities, they were the ones organizing and orchestrating demonstrations against police precincts, asking for support, asking for different materials to be able to organize effectively against all of these different precincts.
So historically, we've seen socialist communist groups kind of infiltrate and then change the group, trying to edge towards socialism. Do you see Antifa doing that?
So it's kind of a little bit difficult to really talk about like Antifa as a whole, because again, it has no leader, it has no movement. It's kind of a bunch of independent selves kind of working towards a common goal. And a lot of them will say, well, the root of fascism is capitalism. So that's their aim, to really fight against what that is. So now looking independently at some of these groups, that is exactly what they're doing. It's a form of organizing called mass lining. There's two major political tactics for Antifa and for all their groups. One of them is called propaganda by the deed, which is when you enact political violence against an individual with the intent that others will join in because they're so inspired by everything that's happening and the fact that people are getting away with it. Well, the other one is a little bit much more complicated. It's called mass line. Well, in mass line, you organize specific sections of society, and by infiltrating these groups and really getting to know what their struggles are, and then organizing their struggles into nice little catchy phrases that they can push. And a lot of people in those communities, they'll think like, yeah, like finally we're speaking out. This is what we need to do. We speak out for our rights. And that's all good and dandy. But if you see the key organizers, they tend to only be pushing policies that will get us slowly and closer towards socialism. And that's exactly what we're seeing today throughout America. You see the left infiltrating college campuses, and they're talking about hate speech and how that's harmful. Well, they're organizing in that sector. It's mass line there. And they're trying to get all the students who want to help, say, transgender students or African-American students, all of those people that people think they tend to be more victimized. Well, they organize them to try to get us away from free speech, closer towards a socialist view. Well, outside of college campuses, you see the exact same thing with police reform right now. Look, there's a problem with policing in America. I think we're kind of beginning to really see that as a society today. But instead of really trying to have a conversation, key organizers are saying, defund the police. That's not an accident. That's something that they're trying to do so they can promote other policies that gets us closer to socialism. And once you infiltrate one sector of society, and then another sector of society, and then another, and then another, whether it be buses, unions, worker unions for steel workers, then all of a sudden you have all these socialist policies throughout the country. And then it's easier to take the leap from a conservative or from a libertarian or from a capitalist market into, say, electing somebody like Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez for president. It's all about getting us closer to socialism, so it's easier for us to adopt it.
So what are some of the biggest, policy threats? You've talked about unions, you've talked about, Bernie Sanders. What are your biggest fears as far as our march towards socialism in America?
Well, right now, especially now, everything that's happening, people are forgetting what this nation was founded on. And it was founded on the idea of freedom, of liberty. And too many people are thinking that the government can take care of us and they can do all of these things for us. And that's not going to work. It's never worked throughout history. Every single government who's ever tried to take care of its people eventually turns against them. And especially on college campuses, what we've been seeing is that there's a renewed push to ban quote unquote hate speech, saying that hate speech is not free speech. Well, that's a little complicated because hate speech is not necessarily free speech. It's just speech. It could be hateful speech, but it's one of the categories that different types of speech fall under. It could be legitimate speech, it could be hate speech, it could be gross, or it could be, there's different categories, my point being. And well, free speech encompasses all of these things. It's not necessarily that hate speech is not free speech. Hate speech is just speech. The question is whether we should allow it in society. And that's a debate that we should be having. But instead, they want to carve out as hate speech being separate from free speech or in general, except that it's just speech in general. And unfortunately, the left is not interested in having those conversations. They just want to push us towards rejecting the Constitution, towards rejecting American ideals, to establish a more left-wing government.
Do you think we've become a society that's too easily offended with things like microaggressions and definitions of hate speech?
Yeah, because I mean, a microaggression will be, where are you from? I get that question a lot. You know, I'm Mexican. Well, was I just microaggressed? Well, if a white person asked me, according to the left, yeah. But guess what? I'm from Mexico. It doesn't matter. Move on from that. I think the real intent of, like, if you really want to talk about what hate speech is the intent. You know, in my past, I have experienced instances of racism. And I've also experienced experiences of people who just don't know. And unfortunately, the left will equate the two. One time, I remember I was driving very young with my family. I can't remember what state, but it was somewhere in the Midwest. And I remember there was a sign that said, no Mexicans allowed. And it was really gross to like feeling. And that was way back before I really remember in being involved in politics. Well, that's one thing, because we can kind of see the intent of like, oh, this person really doesn't like Mexicans. Well, another question, a lot of the times the left will say, that's the same as asking where you're from. And it's not. It really isn't. And unfortunately, so many college students have fallen into this lie that questions like, where are you from? Or what is your name? Or like, do you speak other languages? If maybe you're not quote unquote white, that's like a form of racism. People have become so offended that in fact they're becoming offensive, because in turn they're making it seem like we're victims. I'm not offended if you ask me where I'm from. Not offended if you ask me where my accent's from, which is a mixture of California and from Mexico. You know, like it's fine. We can ask those questions. We really should be looking at the intent of the one speaking, but the left just wants to see everything as offensive.
With Black Lives Matter going on currently, racism is now all over the place. We see it in cops. We see it in, Robin's book, White Fragility. It's like she says, white identity is inherently racist. Like if you look white, apparently you're automatically a racist. I feel like if the definition of racism has become so watered down that it's almost like everything is racist. And if everything's racist, then really nothing's racist. There's no bright line. So in your life experience, let's just go ahead and start there. What have you seen from a young age till now? Has the definition of racism become watered down?
It's become watered down because the reason I joined Antifa and the Antifa movement in general was because I saw a bunch of neo-Nazis marching down my community, and that fired me up. I wanted to do something and really oppose them. Unfortunately, that got me into a rabbit hole of a bunch of different things and radical activism. But even like 10 years ago, we could look at racism and say it was the KKK, it was Nazis, it was some of these white national groups, or sometimes even some of these other groups that are not necessarily white, but they pretend that they're better than all other races. But today society is calling professors racists who aren't liberal, or just they have a different opinion, or they don't want to.
There's no room for disagreement.
There's no room for disagreement. And I'm thinking specifically about the University of California, Los Angeles. There's a professor there who recently, he was asked to exempt the African American students in his classes from taking the final exam. He said, no, I'm not going to do that. You took the class. You need to take the final exam if you want to pass my class. Well, it ended up with him having to have police protection, and the university was looking into whether they should fire him. I'm not even sure if this professor is conservative or liberal.
For asking his students to take a final exam.
Yes. Just because he did not want to exempt his African American students from taking the exam, he became a target from the left.
And is that because they were wanting to participate in the Black Lives Matter rallies, or because they were so deeply troubled with what happened that they weren't?
It's the latter one. They were just deeply troubled, allegedly, that they couldn't take the exam. And I mean, we've seen this kind of demands all over the place. It's happened at Harvard. It's happened at so many universities where they think that just based on the color of their skin, they should get special treatment. And that is the definition of racism. And there's this lie promulgated by so many left-wing professors that only whites can be racist. And that is incredibly false. I mean, speaking back from my own community, and I don't want to paint Mexicans or Hispanics with a broad brush, because there's some communities that are better than others. And I'm definitely wasn't raised like that. But I do remember some communities that they were very discriminatory of non-Mexicans, especially against Cubans, people from El Salvador, all of these different places. And even within those communities, they would sometimes be hateful towards Mexicans. And then I sometimes had African American friends who would be criticize whites or like Hispanics or different races. Racism is an ugly thing that is present in every single country in the world. The question is what we do about it. And in America, we have a great track record over the last 50 years now that we've been pushing for equality. But the left and so many left-wing professors, they pretend that we're the worst country in the world, even though we're one of the greatest countries in the world. I remember back in school, I wrote a paper which looked at hate crimes in general and from the places. And specifically, my paper was talking about how free speech bans were just not effective. I looked at Canada at the United Kingdom. And even though they had really strong hate speech laws, they had like double, triple of the amount of hate crimes per capita than America.
Whoa.
Yeah, and it's just all these things, we're trying to police speech instead of policing people's actions. I'm not interested in really trying to deal with some random racist in some random town. I'm more interested in if he takes that step from his racism to actually trying to attack individuals. But the left, they're putting so much emphasis on the first part that they start creating this us versus them, what do they call it? Us versus them mentality in so many people.
A lot of division.
A lot of division. And if you want to fight against racism, that is not the right way to do it. Because all of a sudden, all of these sections, they start feeling attacked, and they feel like the only way to really fight against it is to band together. Wait, well, guess what? You're creating a more racist society by teaching us to be us versus them.
So let's talk about that, the melding, the meshing, all the connection of ideas. Because in D.C. we saw it was the George Floyd Memorial protest, and then it was Black Lives Matter, and then it was Black Trans Lives Matter, and now it's spun into a bunch of different marches. And then, for those who posted the black square, it was like that was not enough. Now you have to defund the police. It's like all the ideas are connected. It's if you don't hold this left-wing view, therefore you actually don't care that Black Lives Matter.
And again, that's exactly what mass line is. Mass line is not something that's well known. It's something that is in written textbooks and history books of like China, of the way how they really turned
the Cultural Revolution.
The Cultural Revolution, all that. It's something that they effectively did, and it's happening in America since the last almost 100 years now, where you go into the unions and you start infiltrating these different societies or different institutions and turn them a little bit to the left. Well, now we're seeing the effects of that. They're infiltrating African American communities and telling them, "Oh, we need to do something about the police because they're oppressive." Well, it's not gonna be long until they start going into some of the employment for these places and start turning to the left. It's all connected because it is all part of this whole mass line tactic to slowly turn us closer to socialism.
And I'm blanking on the author, but there's a book that says from hashtag Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation. And essentially it connects those ideas saying, well, if you're really for Black Lives Matter, then you have to understand that the real system of oppression is capitalism and we need a socialist system. Is that kind of the trajectory of mass lining is just, it's like this economic overhaul of the whole system?
Yeah, and you slowly kind of turn those everyone, one institution plus one institution, because it's human nature. Once you have a benefit, it's hard to take it away. Once you institute taxes, income tax, it's hard to take it away. It slowly starts creeping in, and that's basically mass lying. And I mean, the problem is that, Black Lives Matter, of course. But the problem is that when people say Black Lives Matter, they're not really talking about African-American communities. They're just using that as a slogan that they came up with to really try to infiltrate some of these institutions and to turn them closer towards socialism. And that's where the debate is. And of course, the left loves to do this. They come up with this catchy tagline. And if you oppose that, you start criticizing it, you start questioning some of the motives, all of a sudden they say, well, you don't care about Black Lives Matter, or for Antifa, oh, you are pro-fascism, we're anti-fascism. They create this us versus them mentality, when in fact, we are just questioning some of the central points in it, because there is no idea that should be left unquestioned. Even conservatives, we deserve and we need to welcome criticism of our ideas. But the left is not willing to do that. If you have a question, if you decide, I'm not sure if this is really what we should do, start questioning it, all of a sudden you became the enemy.
And that's what happened to you, right?
That is what happened to me. I mean, for Antifa in general, all these leftist groups, I started learning more about capitalism, free market economics in general. Started asking questions. Well, that was enough for people to start calling me capitalist pig.
So much for being tolerant.
Yeah, so much for being tolerant. And that's the problem. As soon as you start asking questions about some of their more fine line points, they push you out.
So it's become a popular talking point, especially amongst the millennial generation, to claim that America's made no progress in the last 50, 60 years on racism or race relations in America. What would you say to somebody who espouses that idea?
Well, it's just blatantly false. We are living in a much better society today than we were living about 10 years ago or 20 years ago. The problem comes from professors. They're teaching their students that there's this us versus them mentality. So many universities try to put emphasis on quote unquote diversity, and they'll make programs specifically for Native American students, for Black students, for Hispanic students. And they start shutting out all of these different groups. And then at these seminars, you go into them and they tell you, oh, if you're white, you're racism. Or they'll just straight out say, whites aren't allowed. I remember a few years ago when I was working I'm still working for the Leadership Institute, but I was a field representative for the Leadership Institute. And I went to No Whites Allowed art show at the Claremont colleges. This is, I think, in 2016, I think. I'm not 100% sure, around there. And I remember going in, as a person of color, I walked in like no questions asked. But some of the things that they were saying is just ridiculous, saying that like whites were racist, that like being in a room with a white person people feel threatened by being in a room with a white person. And the reason people believe that race relations are not better is not because of actual racists or the traditional racism as we see it, because of these professors who pretend that they're so enlightened, yes, that they're promoting an us versus them mentality. If race relations have gotten worse, is not because of racism itself, but because professors are teaching racism into every lecture.
It feels like they're almost in this like academic fairy tale land. The book White Fragility claims that all white people are inherently racist, and that because America is majority white or has been for its history, therefore we've been inherently racist from the beginning. And then she uses as these examples like these seminars that she's taught where she says, white people will either ignore the issue, they'll deny the issue, or they'll be angry that I'm calling them a racist. And all of these reactions, whether it's no reaction or a big reaction, is just proof that they're racist. It seems like this big circular reasoning argument. Are you seeing that?
To the left, the only way you're not a racist if you agree with them without question. That's basically what it is. And even then, they'll still criticize you for being white. They'll still say, but you were privileged, all of these different things. You know, the problem is that they pretend that racism is uniquely American. I believe there was a senator recently who said that America did not inherit racism, that we created it. Well, that's ridiculous.
Oh
Unfortunately, it is a part of human nature, and it's so unfortunate that all throughout history we've had slavery. All throughout history we've had wars
on every continent,
on every single
every
thing.
culture. Yeah.
Of course, racism is a problem, and we have to work towards becoming more of an equal society. That's an ongoing struggle that for the rest of our eternity, humans are going to have to deal with. But to say that is uniquely American is it's not only false, but we have to look at the intent. Why are they singling out America? Well, America is the most prosperous country on earth. Why? Because we've adopted so many values that are free market or freedom, free speech, and that's what led to our wealth. They don't want...
allows for people to be creative and thrive and create ideas,
They believe that capitalism is the reason why everybody else in the world is poor. They blame America for this. They think that capitalism is racism. That's why they want to destroy it. Now, we have to look at their intent as well, because at the end of the day, they do want equality. They do want to live free or free.
But it's less about like recognizing all men were created equal and more about demanding equal outcomes, right?
Yeah, it really is. They want to make sure that that they don't really care about somebody working very hard and somebody working anything. Nothing for nothing. If the person who's not working, if they're hungry, they're suffering. Even let's look at the most caricature way of looking at this. If a person tries, they get fired, they lose their job, and all of a sudden they become homeless. All of a sudden, the person who fired him becomes the victim without looking at, like, maybe he got fired for, I don't know, embezzlement or like not doing his work, not paying attention, all these different things.
So the employer is immediately the oppressor.
Yeah, he's the oppressor, no matter the circumstances.
No matter the circumstances.
And if we look at this in the world stage, well, America is the richest country in the world, so they must be the ones who are oppressing all of these other countries. And instead of looking, what is each individual country doing? Some countries are doing better than others.
It wasn't too long ago we had the Rwandan genocide.
Exactly.
And that was black on black.
Yeah, and what do they call it? If we look at some of those countries that were used to be wealthy, in Latin America specifically, Venezuela. Well, guess what? 20 years ago, one of the richest countries in I think it was the richest country in Latin America. They got a socialist president. It's now one of the poorest, and people are struggling. It's not capitalism. It's their socialist view, and not even the socialist view, is the idea that government can fix people's lives. It can't. But unfortunately, they want to single out America because it's such a wonderful country that in their worldview, if you're rich, if you're wealthy, you must have stolen it from somebody to get there.
Do you think there's a spirit of like envy and greed behind that belief?
I think in part of it, there is a little bit of that, but some of the people who are sometimes promoting these kind of values are rich themselves, which is pretty ironic. Often Hollywood will, and so many people in Hollywood, they promote this anti-capitalism view. I'm thinking of people like Jim Carrey or like Leonardo DiCaprio, who spends millions of dollars on private jets and private cruises when he travels to conferences for climate change and all these things. And they think, they don't see it as greed. They see themselves as being selfless. They see themselves as helping society and helping just people in general. But they could give $1 million to any charity or anything. The fact that they are famous is actually more helpful to society than them giving $1 million. And why is that? Because a lot of people went to go see their show. And that fed a lot more people. The production families, the movie theaters, the distributors. Capitalism feeds more people than any type of charity.
Does Antifa have leaders? I mean, there's Mark Bray's book, The Anti-Fascist Handbook. So there are some thought leaders. But as a movement per se, are there people pulling the strings at the top? Or is it much more disorganized than that?
So I wouldn't say at the top. because again, it has no official structure. But it would be wrong to say that Antifa doesn't have some form of organizing. And if you look at some of the regional leaders, I like to call them, these are members of some of the Antifa type groups, and which have more of a structure. For example, in California, we have By Any Means Necessary. There was a middle school, or I think no, it was below high school. Her name was Yvette Falarca. She was a K through 12 student, teacher. Well, she was a regional leader, and she was an actual, like, official leader of the BAM. Now, I wouldn't say she's the leader of Antifa, but she has enough influence that she's able to organize within her community.
And she was on the news promoting and defending Antifa and the violence.
So it would be wrong to say that the Antifa movement doesn't have key leaders. Also, we have in the East Coast, there was a professor from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I think his name is Daryl Dixon. I could get that wrong, but he's the leader of his chapter of the Redneck Revolt, which is another official Antifa type organization. So these members are the ones organizing within their community. But again, going back to mass lining, you don't need to have somebody at the top. And in fact, for the radical leftists, having somebody straight at the top is dangerous, because then you can take them down.
It's kind of like grassroots slowly pushing people towards socialism.
Exactly. But you have all of these mass line efforts. Well, Yvette Falarca is doing her work independently of Daryl Dixon, but they're all promoting the same ideas, which is to be pro-socialism. And it is a much more effective way to really organize this way. And I mean, there's key regional leaders all throughout the country like that, but it's really hard to pin down because they're not directly connected with one another. They may be connected with one here and one there, but in general, it's a little bit harder. And specifically, Mark Bray, the reason he was able to write that book isn't because he was a historian, a professor, and all of a sudden he's like, Antifa, I'll write a book about that. No, if you look at read his book, he talks about how he used to be a regional leader within the Occupy movement. And that's how he started gaining all of these connections. And obviously, he's not connected to every single Antifa type faction, but there was enough for him to really write about the whole motive of the movement as a whole.
So let's talk about those connections. What are some other groups that maybe aren't called Antifa but espouse the same ideas? You talked about By Any Means Necessary with Yvette Falarca. There's the Black Rose or the Red Rose, and you said Redneck Revolt. What are some other groups that people should be aware of?
So there's some national groups that we really should be looking at. There's what are they called? The Anarchist Black Cross is a national group. It still works in different chapters. It's chapter based, but it's a national organization. But then there's some groups that may seem innocuous. They may seem like they're just out there, but they're definitely within the whole Antifa movement. We have the IWW, the International Workers of the World, and it has a history of just doing organizing all throughout the world. Well, if you actually look at some of their more radical activists, you'll see them show up at some of the Antifa protests saying like, oh yeah, workers' rights, we support Antifa and all these things. But I think what's more dangerous than some of these other national groups is all these independent groups that kind of prop up out of nowhere. And they're all over the place. I remember when I was part of the whole movement, I had an independent one that was not connected with any individual organization. And even though they were only about 10 minutes away, there was about another one, which is Direct Action Claremont, which is 10 minutes away from where I lived. And you have all of these little independent groups, and they're hard to get to. Because let's say that we find a conspiracy of of the Anarchist Black Cross in Los Angeles County, and you have you're able to arrest every single official member, non-official member, etc. Well, you didn't get all of them. You didn't get all the independent groups that are not officially connected with the Anarchist Black Cross.
Espousing the same ideas, but under a different name.
Often working in collaboration with the same groups, but they're not part of the same. They're not directly connected, so it's a little bit harder to connect them to that conspiracy where they're one.
It sounds really similar to other terrorist groups we've seen throughout history, particularly Al-Qaeda and ISIS, where they started with these cells in different parts, and it's like you get these groupings, and then it becomes a big movement. Do you think Antifa is taking one out of those playbooks?
Yes, and it's a very similar organizing. Look, I'm not an expert on foreign policy, and I'm not an expert on specifically on Islam, but I do know that do know that there's a debate about what jihad means. Some people believe that it's a spiritual reawakening, and and some people believe it's a call to military action. Well, let's look at the ones who are actually espousing the military route. To be part of the jihad, you don't have to join ISIS. You don't have to join Al-Qaeda. You don't have to join any of those groups. You could do it on your own. To espouse that
independent actors.
The independent actors of the jihad. Well, Antifa works in a very similar way. You don't have to be a member of the Anarchist Black Cross. You don't have to be a member of the Young Democratic Socialists of America, BAM, Redneck Revolt, all of these different groups. You could be part of the Antifa movement as an individual by promoting the same type of left-wing politics.
And so I've seen two signs pop up time and time again where it's hate speech is violence, and their definition of hate speech is very broad, and then you also see silence is violence. Those seem contradictory to me.
Well, in their mind, it's not contradictory at all. In their mind, it makes perfect sense. And it comes down with what they really want, and it's ideological purity. They believe that if you're going to speak out, you should only speak out if you are going to agree with them. If you start having questions, if you say, well, look, Black Lives Matter, of course, Black Lives Matter, but if I kind of don't agree with the way you guys are going about it, all of a sudden you must be racist.
They're all connected. It's like if you say Black Lives Matter, but you don't want to defund the police and you don't want socialism, therefore you don't really believe Black Lives Matter.
It's an all or nothing type of mentality.
It's like this ideological purity.
That's really what they're looking for. They're looking only for people who are willing to be just a warm body for their movement. They are not looking to have a conversation. They're not looking to have anything but complete and total victory. And that is what the Antifa mentality is. For example, when I used to do protests and be part of the Antifa movement in general, we would always promote certain values, like being anti-racism or anti whatever that might be. Well, what did that look like? We would say, just stop, just absolutely nothing. You have no opinion on anything, because if you decide to speak out on, say, immigration, or that's not favorable to immigrants or for anything,
there was no nuance to the views. You just had to tout the slogan, the anti-racism, pro-immigrant, but it's not even really pro-immigrant. It's just open borders,
Often that was the case, yeah.
What would you say is one of the biggest misconceptions about Antifa?
One of the biggest misconceptions about Antifa is the idea that it's well-funded and it's well-organized in a traditional sense. A lot of people point to, say, people like George Soros, and he must be funding it. I'm and it's funny because some people on the left, I've read some comments of that people leave my videos, and they say, oh, what's it called? I didn't see him in the payroll. He must have not been part of Antifa. Just joking around of this idea. And obviously, these people who are commenting, they're probably part of the movement in general. Well, George Soros, or no national organization, at least to my knowledge, is funding Antifa as a whole. And it comes from the fact that it's not a traditional group. You have
these cells,
it's
right?
all of these different cells within America. And they're all doing independent work of one another. And that is much more dangerous than any one funded organization. Because when you have an actual group with goals and missions, and not only will it have a lot of money, but it'll also have a lot of troubles in trying to stay on message and trying to really promote their ideas. But when you have all of these different groups throughout the world, essentially, that are promoting the same ideas, all of a sudden it becomes a quote-unquote grassroots movement, and it's a mass line, and you start pushing slowly and slowly. And the best part of organizing Antifa in this manner is that you really can't stop it by traditional means. You can't just go to the leader of an organization and then say you were doing this. You can't do that.
The ideas are already out there.
The ideas are already out there. And it is far more dangerous to have all of these different groups promoting this violence than just one group. And I think that every time people say that it must be funded by George Soros, they're not getting the whole picture. And it's actually dangerous, because then they have this all of these Antifa type groups, they can say,
it's kind of a naive view that if you just get rid of Soros, the problem's going to go away.
Yeah, it's not.
Yeah.
And it's after Soros passes, there's going to be other rich people who are liberals and Democrats who want to fund the same type of projects as he did. But even they're not really the problem. The problem is often that all these professors are promoting this anti-American and anti-capitalist views, and they encourage their students to join Antifa type groups. And that's really the problem. If you want to look at funding, it's not one person. If you really want to look at funding in a more theoretical way, or more of like, it's universities, because they're funding this ideology.
These ideas.
They're funding the ideas, and they're spreading like wildfire throughout the country.
Yeah, I think it sounds a lot similar to what you hear the left criticize the right. Oh, you're just getting Coke money. They kind of, it's like Coke versus Soros, and sure, like those individuals and their businesses are funding a lot of left-wing and right-wing groups.
Sure.
But that doesn't always necessarily trickle down to the grassroots, people who are actually in the streets doing the protests. Sure, some of them might be connected, or they might be a professional protester or involved in a nonprofit or a university. There have been tons of campus professors that have been arrested protesting. But to say that it's all Soros or all Coke is maybe a bit naive.
Yeah, it is naive. And I mean, I remember in 2016 when I was conservative at the time, former Senator Harry Reid from Nevada, he used to go on the Senate floor and just completely criticize and defame the Koch brothers. He would say, "Oh, the Koch brothers are at it again." When if you look at how much money they were giving away to campaigns in general, I think they were like 50 something in line. Don't get me wrong, the Koch brothers are giving a lot of money away to liberty and conservative causes.
But there were 49 others.
Yeah, they were like 49 above
way
them.
More money
and
than them.
I remember for 2016, the number one donor was a Democrat. Giving to, I think 99% or 100% of his money that he gave to was specifically to liberal and left-wing causes. And then the next person after that, I think it was like $10 million. There was a $10 million gap between the number one and two. So to say that all of these like rich people are kind of controlling politics is naive. You really have to look at the grassroots and at the ground level who is orchestrating all of these riots and these protests.
Thanks so much for watching this video. To watch our latest video, click here. And to make sure you don't miss any future videos, be sure to subscribe.